This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news. Hello, and welcome back to the Week in Sustainability. I'm Alyssa Raid, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain Life, and I am honored today to welcome as guest our CEO, Annalie Bloomfield.
Thank you so much for having me. And I am honored to be here to get to talk about COP28. This is it's like the highlight of the year. Well, okay, we're about to get into the controversy, all the things surrounding it, but it is a highlight of the year. It's a time when um, representatives from almost 200 countries come together to talk about climate. It's really exciting. And we usually see a lot of really big announcements. So it's kind of like one of these events that I think, especially in our industry, people take a lot of notice of, and it sort of anchors the year a little bit. So, as we said with COP28, this is the 28th COP, which stands for Conference of the Parties. It's hosted by the UN, and it brings together, as we mentioned, those 200 different countries and their representatives, but also climate scientists and journalists and business leaders and crucially, activists, right? And young people, which has also been a big theme this year. So, always really interesting to see what comes out of that. I think if you're not familiar with COP, or sort of past COPs, because obviously they happen every year. So there's a lot that comes out. The one that's probably the most well known was COP. Let me remember right. I think this was COP. It's the COP in 2015, which is in Paris. And
21.
so that was COP 21. Sorry. And that was where we had the Paris Agreement, where you start to mention 1.5 degree scenarios for the first time. And I think a lot of folks feel like that 1.5 degree number, even though I think the consensus now is that we're probably going to get past that. We're probably going to warm more than 1.5 degrees. That number and putting it out there in this really big kind of global agreement really put an anchor in the discourse about global warming. And that's really meaningful.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that even though you're right, the 1.5 threshold is dangerously close to just not being physically achievable. It is still the scenario off of which all of this policy and national commitments and all this activity is anchored on. And that's really critical because you have to align the policy and, the design, the implementation roadmaps off of your most ambitious goal because frankly, it's not all going to work out. And so even though it's very difficult to achieve, important to note, it is still the guiding light in all of this climate policy.
Totally. And even for us, right, like with our science-based targets feature where we help folks start setting those targets for the first time, that's all anchored around a 1.5 degree scenario. So even, like for sort of national policy, but also coming down even to individual businesses, right? Like that 1.5 degree mark is so critical. So
Yeah,
I think those are the kinds of announcements and agreements that we can see come out of COP, and they can end up being really impactful. Although obviously that was COP 21, we're up to 28. We maybe don't have a huge number of announcements prior to that we want to highlight right now, but still exciting. And I think actually there was a really major announcement this year. So we'll get into all of that. And with that, Alyssa, do
yeah,
you want to talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the controversy around
I
COP?
do. And we'll get to all the good stuff because it was impactful and there's a lot of exciting announcements that have come out. But this COP, and this has kind of been a trend that's been happening for the past couple of years, was really kind of mired in a bit of skepticism and a lot of controversy. COP28 was held in Dubai, the UAE, which is a petrostate itself. And on top of that, the president of COP, the leader of the entire climate conference, is Sultan Al Jaber, who's the CEO of Abu Dhabi's national oil company. And so from the very beginning, there was just a lot of skepticism around this COP of the oil lobbyists and kind of oil members and point of view having such a prominent and present role at a climate conference. Um, I frankly am a little bit on both sides of the fence on this. I think it's really hard to have a constructive and frankly realistic conversations about the energy transition and climate change without having stakeholders from the group that causes the most impact, those, fossil fuel groups. I do think the inclusion of all these lobbyists, kind of swings it a little bit too far in that direction. And then to really kick things off on a very unstable foot, just days before the conference, Al Jaber was quoted as essentially saying that there's no climate science or there's no science out there supporting the phase out of fossil fuels to mitigate the climate crisis, which he rolled back, pretty quickly. But the fact that he said that kind of so openly just days ahead of this conference really kind of put the activists and a lot of those, involved in this space kind of on high alert.
Totally. Yeah. And then I think also right before the conference, there were leaked documents showing that they were trying to do kind of like oil deals, especially with the developing world, like at the conference,
Yeah.
which is sort of like shocking, frankly.
Yeah, and, we'll get into this a little bit later, but, like, there were new deals for oil and gas exploration signed at COP, and so I think that's a very real testament and example of a little bit of what COP has become, um, and just a testament to, the realities of, like, you have this big conference, you're bringing all these global leaders together and all these activists and those involved in this sector, but at the same time, like, this is what's happening on the other side of the coin. It's not all a rosy picture. It's not all just progress and moving forward and commitments. Like, there are very real, um, policies and economic and business decisions that are being made that very much ingrain us in the fossil fuel economy.
Yeah, and I mean, the crazy thing is this year we had, I think, more than 100,000 registered attendees for COP,
Mhm.
which is more than any other year by a pretty wide margin. I think that was
Yeah.
almost 3 times as many as COP26, which was just 2 years ago. And to your point on kind of the folks in the room, I think so that was a 3x growth over COP26. It was a 4x growth in fossil fuel lobbyists, which is kind of giving you a sense of like how many lobbyists there were in the room. I know some of the articles I was reading were saying that, in some of the rooms where they were debating some of these really critical topics, like particularly around the global stock take and how we talk about fossil fuels, there were more fossil fuel lobbyists than there were representatives from island nations, right? Who are so
Yeah.
impacted by this. So it's tough to see. And I think, I mean, one sort of good step forward here with it, this is the first year that the UN has required participants to disclose who they work for. So I think in the past, this sense of like, oh, there's fossil fuel lobbyists, but we didn't necessarily know all the numbers really exactly. And so
Yeah.
now we have a much better sense, which is like on the one hand really disturbing, but on the other hand, transparency starts to breed attention, and
Of
that
course.
will hopefully sort of change that narrative a little bit. And there have been some recommendations made by, I think, US senators and some folks in the EU arguing that those with sort of conflicts of interest shouldn't be allowed to attend, and sort of starting to think about putting some limits on who attends COP, which is,
Yeah.
um, maybe something we'll see in the future.
Yeah, I wonder, we even at Sustain Life, we had a presence at
Yeah.
COP27 last year, and we spoke on a panel with a bunch of leaders on the digital transformation of decarbonization. And we struggled of whether or not we wanted to attend this year. COP is amazing, and we promise we're going to get into all of the exciting announcements that came out of it. But it's a real struggle. It has become a little bit of a who's who. You go because everybody else is going, and like, is it the most meaningful and efficient way of progressing the climate agenda? For all of those who aren't the actual government leaders negotiating these
Totally.
policies, maybe not. But you did manage loss. You mentioned loss and damage, and so let's get into the exciting things, lest we, push down COP too much without pumping it back up. So there were a couple of highlights that we want to focus on today. One was on the loss and damage fund. Now, funding debates are always a major feature of the UN climate negotiations. You have global leaders from the North and the South, and this was a really big one this year. They actually did announce at the end of COP27 last year that they agreed to start kind of the loss and damage fund. And then it took a whole year for them to actually establish the fund. So day one of COP this year, they wanted to start out on a high note, and the fund has been established. And just a reminder on what loss and damage funds are. Essentially, the huge injustice of the climate crisis is that the poorest and most vulnerable nations to climate change are the ones that did the least amount to actually cause this crisis, right? They have contributed the least amount to the actual warming that is now so impactful to their daily lives and economies. And so the high note here is that the Loss and Damage Fund was established at the opening plenary. Big win. First time that the global north of wealthy nations have actually agreed to fund a loss and damage fund, which is basically funding the global south and poorer, more vulnerable nations for resilience and mitigation support. Um, Now, a reminder here that the low note is that we kind of had announced this in the past, and frankly, countries that commit to these funds don't have a very good track record in actually funding them. So the wealthy nations have pledged $700 million. Sounds like a big amount, but actually, that's like literally 0.2% of what is needed annually to actually address what's needed as a mitigation mechanism in these countries, with current estimates around like anywhere between 100 billion to $600 billion.
Yeah, and I think this is right. I think this year alone, we've had 24 different climate disasters in the US that each cost more than $1 billion. Yeah. So if you think about that, that's $24 billion of cost in the US, which is not facing anywhere near the kinds of
Yes.
disasters that we see in the global south and particularly in island nations. So that $700 million number versus even just the US cost
Yeah.
is completely out of whack, much less what you need in sort of the entire developing world.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. So it's like, great, good start. You've all committed and pledged, but the numbers just aren't quite adding up to where we know they need to be in order to actually be impactful.
So we're hearing more and more about methane and coolants, which are other greenhouse gases beyond carbon dioxide, which have a much higher global warming potential. So methane, for example, is 86 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. And it also breaks down much faster in the atmosphere. So there's starting to be a lot more focus on reducing methane and other kind of coolant emissions faster and focusing on it now, because the thought is that because they break down so quickly, we can really pull a lot of that like really high warming potential gas out of the atmosphere really quickly. And the other cool thing about these is that they also, and again, this is similar to so many things in sustainability where they're cross cutting and they have multiple impacts, but particularly with methane. It also causes all kinds of air particulate challenges. So it is really a global health challenge as well. So it's sort of exciting to see both like the global warming focus and also the global health focus. So the new announcements that we had around methane in particular. So there's a new rule from the US which requires regular inspection of oil and gas facilities. It forces producers to plug methane leaks and stop burning off excess gas with flares. And so methane, these kinds of methane leaks are really a byproduct of oil and gas production. So that's kind of where this is focused. They're expecting it to phase in over the next year, and it's expected to save millions of tons of methane per year. And this has been a big focus for the US for a while. Like there's a big part of the IRA, it's also focused on methane reduction. And so it's exciting to see kind of like more policy come out that's specifically focused there, again, especially because of that really high global warming potential.
Yep.
We got similar announcements from the EU, and they're also starting to apply some of those same rules to imports and exports, which is great because you're starting to see that impact outside the EU as well. And as like Alyssa was saying with the loss and damage fund, it sort of doesn't matter that much unless you actually have funding for it. So the US announced $1 billion grant to help lower income countries improve their methane emissions management as well. So obviously the US announcement was for US producers, but this fund is intended to help kind of lower income countries globally.
Yep.
And then separately on the coolant side and sort of refrigerants, we had 63 countries sign the cooling pledge at COP28. And so the pledge is essentially around reducing cooling related emissions by 68% by 2050. And so it's looking at refrigeration for food and medicine, as well as the use of air conditioning. And that's so important because as the world gets warmer, you see more and more parts of the world where folks want air conditioning and need air conditioning, right? Because it just gets too hot to really live during some parts of the day or parts of the season. And this is another one where as the developing world gets wealthier, air conditioning is one of those sort of signals of wealth that more and more people are going to want to have. And so it's really important that we start putting some standards in place, especially around energy efficiency and then how you're sort of handling those coolants, because we expect the market for air conditioning as well as other kinds of coolants, right? Like thinking about cold chain for food, like all of those kind of enhancements in living are really expected to grow over the next decade. So great to see folks focusing on that too.
Yeah, I think that the whole methane and coolants and kind of other greenhouse gases is maybe one of, I guess it depends who you ask, but maybe one of the less sexy announcements that comes out of
Yeah,
COP, but in my
agreed.
opinion is one of the really pragmatic, like operational ones. It almost seems like yeah, we should obviously be plugging methane leaks that have no productive value to us, even the oil and gas industry, and literally have policies and standards in place that require companies to plug leaks and then not burn those gases in flares. And so this is one that I think is really important. And to me, really just like raises, that lower bar of what the
Right.
baseline expectation is as like, this is, if you're going to operate, this is how you're going to do it.
No, I think that's exactly right. And exciting to see a little bit more kind of leadership globally, especially I think there's a particular project with I think Kazakhstan, which is one of the biggest sort of methane emitters. And it's interesting, honestly, because so much of this we're only learning about in the last few years as we've started to have better satellite imaging, right? So that we're actually aware of how much methane is leaking. Because I think
Hmm.
this is one of those like with any gas, right? It's invisible, but this is a major issue, and especially given the global warming potential, it's like a really impactful issue that we
Yeah.
just like haven't had visibility into. So
Yep. Yep.
agreed, excited about it.
Absolutely. Totally. All right. Well, we'll continue on with energy for a little bit. So, one of the more widely supported initiatives was around an energy pledge. So, 118 governments, and remember, there's 200 representatives. So, we're talking, well more than half, signed a pledge to triple the world's renewable energy capacity by 2030. That's clearly what we need. That is super exciting. This was something that was led by the EU, the US, and the UAE. And it's one of the many pledges that were aimed at decarbonizing the energy sector, which, as we know, accounts for like 3/4 of global emissions. There was also a smaller cohort of 22 countries that was led by the US that signed a separate pledge to triple nuclear power specifically by 2050 from 2020 levels. So some of the other activities that were going on in the kind of the energy and power space were pledges around expanding nuclear, cutting methane emissions, as you just said, and then choking off private finance to coal. And so that's kind of that two-pronged or, approach that you need. And like, yes, you need to incentivize and fund and create the policies in place to facilitate clean energy production and that energy transition. But you also need to kind of disincentivize and, have intentional policies around the fossil fuel side of it as well.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think to your point around methane, where we're sort of like raising the floor a little bit, it feels like some of the work with coal is kind of raising the floor, right? Like
Yeah.
coal is the worst thing we could be doing here. And then there are so many other fuels, and we'll get into this idea of like transition fuels, which
Yeah.
are a whole other issue, but like at least we're raising the floor around trying to phase out some of the coal stuff. So
Yep.
that's positive. All right, turning from energy a little bit, we'll talk about agriculture. So, agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. It's more than a third of the contribution to climate change, and it was a really big focus this year at COP. They had a full day just focused on agriculture, and much of that was looking at meat and dairy, which together represent about half of ag sector emissions globally. And this is, similar to the idea of air conditioning, right? Like meat is really tricky because it brings up these issues of equity across the global north and south. And ultimately, it kind of comes down to people, right? And what we're choosing to do. And so, similarly to, if you live somewhere really hot and you have the funds, of course, you want an air conditioner. Similarly, if you, have the funds and you want to eat meat, like it's really hard to legislate that away, especially when it's a common practice in much of the global north. So, so despite all of that kind of controversy, we had 130 different countries agree to make farm and food systems a key part of their plans to fight climate change. And they signed this declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action, where they're really looking at scaling agricultural adaptation, improving food security, and then also offering farmers assistance to maximize climate and environmental benefits. So this one, again, it's to the point around sort of the not sexy announcements. I feel like energy is like always the really cool one. And
Yeah.
but really when you think about agriculture being more than a third of the global emissions, like it's really an important sector.
Yeah.
And it's tough because it comes down to individuals making decisions every single day. So exciting to see a little bit more focus there too.
Yeah. Totally, completely agree. Okay, to shift just a little bit to something that is maybe again back on the world of the less visible to us. There was actually a lot of attention paid and significant focus to voluntary carbon markets, especially on the front end of COP this year. So I think it is no secret that voluntary carbon markets have had a pretty tough year. This year, there's been a lot of allegations around how poorly monitored and standardized, and frankly, effective they are at actually removing or doing the things they say about offsetting carbon from the global inventory. And so there's been this big effort to create a more credible market. And the leader here, surprisingly enough, and I actually think this is so amazing, is IOSCO. So IOSCO is the International Organization of Security Commissions. This is basically like the group of regulators that regulate global security markets. And they, I will say, are also the ones that are really so involved and have been a huge stakeholder in the ISSB and IFRS and the whole idea of interoperable standardized sustainability and climate reporting. And so now this group of regulators that is used to regulating securities and capital markets is bringing the same rigor and proposed a 21 feature safety measure to enhance the integrity and transparency of the voluntary carbon market. And so I think that's amazing because we are seeing this across the board, whether it's on carbon accounting, climate disclosure, sustainability reporting. There is this move towards applying the same rigor and standards of financial accounting to carbon as we do to dollars. And so I actually thought this to me was maybe one of the sexiest. I don't know. The fact that IOSCO is leading this charge and created this standard is to me was a huge sign and indicator of, I think, the um, rigor and just improvement that we're going to see behind the voluntary carbon markets.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in general, seeing IOSCO's engagement around things like the ISSB and obviously voluntary carbon markets, um, you know, I think increasingly we see that our clients are coming to us from accounting groups, right? They're reporting up into CFOs. We increasingly see accounting organizations owning sustainability metrics and
Yep,
particularly carbon accounting. And so it's great to see, I think, more of the kind of really structured and well respected guidance coming in for those groups because like if you have accountants in your life, they really like having really clear rules and guidance, right? And
yes,
so I think it's tough asking a group who are historically so focused on audit and credibility to take carbon accounting really serious way without giving them the rules that they also need to really understand how to do it. So it's very exciting.
totally. I agree. I mean, I spend a lot of time, as you know, with the kind of advisory and audit practices in the finance office and teams. And, you know, they always look to Sarbanes Oxley as this policy that really standardized and reduced risk in financial accounting and markets. And I think that's exactly what this 21 measure or standard that IOSCO is proposing is all about. It's about de-risking the carbon markets because we know that it is going to be a critical and permanent part of corporate climate strategy and also globally we got to take carbon out of the air. We have to stop more carbon from being produced. And these financial mechanisms that incentivize that are going to be part of that strategy.
No, it's exciting to see. All right, moving on to kind of our last big takeaway here. And this one is like both exciting and not exciting. So another sort of like controversial moment. And this was really about how fossil fuels were mentioned in the final global stocktake and sort of the final kind of document coming out of. And so the big question was how they were going to be mentioned. And so activists have been pushing for a long time for this freeze fossil fuel phase out. And so they want to see companies, or excuse me, countries committing to phase out their use of fossil fuel rather than this idea of a phase down or like a transition. So we didn't get that language, but for the very first time, we did have fossil fuels actually mentioned in a COP document, which is like really exciting. Like 20 COPs later, we finally got fossil fuels mentioned. And the language that they ended up using was transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. So it's not the phase out language that we'd really like to see. And I think one of the later pieces of the agreement sort of talks about countries being able to follow their own paths to net zero. And that kind of like opens the door to transition fuels, which we mentioned earlier, which it mostly refers to natural gas. And, look, it does emit less CO2 than coal, but it's still a fossil fuel. And the more that we build out infrastructure for fossil fuels, the more that we're slowing down the transition that we really need to renewables and to a really, sort of electric future. So anyway, so it's very exciting to see this language around fossil fuels appearing at all. And I think the sort of overall sort of takeaway that I've seen at least has been that the delegates who worked on it were really excited and that people came
Mhm.
away feeling really energized. And there was like a real shift in tone where, we started the conference with this like sort of hangover of being in a petro state with all these fossil fuel lobbyists, with this COP president who was trying to do fossil fuel deals like on the side. But I think there was so much kind of swirl at the beginning of this. And then at the end, we came out with some language that actually does talk about moving away from fossil fuels. So that was exciting. But I know, Alyssa, there's still a long way to go.
Yes. This is another one that I'm not quite sure how I feel about it because obviously, yes, great. We finally have the word fossil fuels in a final COP document. You use the word exciting. I use the word shocking, maybe even alarming. Like, how is this the first time that the word fossil fuel is in a
So true.
final like COP document? So, yeah, that to me is just very telling. I do think that the language they used, and look, I personally am a realist about these things of transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. I think there's a certain degree of realism there that I appreciate. Like, it's not, to try to decouple energy and, the fossil fuels from economies is not realistic, right? That is the reality of how we built our global economies. And so, in order to be able to, continue and build a stable, secure, resilient economy moving forward, you can't just flick a switch and make it happen, right? There's a certain reality. And so I'm a little bit torn because, like you said, then you get into like the practicalities of transition fuels. And I remember being in grad school, and that was a long time ago. And, talking about fracking. And it was when the US was really deciding how, what is the policy on fracking going to be? Is this something we're going to open up? And it was like, well, it's better than coal. So it is, better for the climate and decarbonization. But then you're putting all this infrastructure in place that takes decades and frankly even centuries to unwind and dial back. And so there's a little bit of this in that as well, that if you just don't make the hard commit to the renewable energy, it just makes it that much harder to really make that transition overall. So when we look ahead, what's coming up next? The next 2 years are really critical. COP29 is going to be in Azerbaijan. And at that COP, governments have to establish new climate finance goals that really reflect the scale and urgency of the climate challenge. And then 2 years from now at COP30, the governments have to prepare new NDCs, those nationally determined contributions that are economy wide, cover all greenhouse gases, and are fully aligned with the 1.5 temperature limit. So I think actually that the closing thought I kind of want to end with is a quote, not so ironically, but by Sultan Al Jaber, which is he had essentially in his closing statements at closing plenary said, an agreement is only as good as its implementation. And that this is a historic consensus, that this is only the beginning of the road ahead. And I actually really agree with it. I think COPs are amazing. We see all these pledges and commitments, and we're going to do this. But frankly, the proof is in the pudding, right? It's only as good as your ability to execute and implement on those goals. And so I do think we have a very long road ahead to actually implement.
Yeah, agreed. But also, look, we have, incentives in the US like the IRA. We're seeing similar kinds of levels of funding in the EU or even in Australia. And so, hopefully we start to see countries really put their money where their mouth is. And ideally, not only within their own borders, right? But also looking at some of these like cross-border funds, like the loss and damage fund, the methane fund,
Mhm.
and really seeing people kind of um, put their money to work that way.
Yep. Could not agree more. Great.
Wow.
Well, Annalie, thank you so much for joining me on today's Week in Sustainability. We
Thanks for
gave
having
everybody
me.
a long one, but an exciting one. This one was worth it.
Totally. No, huge themes and really a wrap up to the year, right? So, we'll see next year at COP29 how things are looking.
Absolutely.
Maybe you'll have
Well,
me back then.
I hope to have you back before then, but
Uh,
awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This was the Week in Sustainability, and we will see you again soon. Sustain Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to sustain.life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.